The gate slammed shut at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in January, and 43 families were trapped inside Maplewood Estates like sardines in a very cold, very expensive tin can. I know the exact time because I was standing right there in my driveway, engine running, breath fogging up the air, watching the wrought iron gate lurch halfway open and then shudder to a grinding, mechanical stop. The temperature on my dashboard read 12 degrees Fahrenheit, not the wind chill, the actual temperature. 12 degrees. The kind of cold that makes your nose hairs freeze the second you step outside and makes your car door hinges squeal like a dying animal every time you try to open them. I'd been coming back from a late hardware store run because my upstairs bathroom pipe had started making that ominous gurgling sound that every homeowner in a cold climate knows means trouble is coming, and I wanted to get some pipe insulation tape before it became a full-blown crisis. I pulled up to the gate at the entrance of Maplewood Estates, pressed my key fob, and absolutely nothing happened. I tried again. Nothing. I rolled down my window despite the brutal cold and pressed the intercom button. Silence. The gate just sat there, half-heartedly cracked open about 18 inches, which was not enough for my truck to squeeze through, and the little motor box on the side was making a sound like a coffee grinder chewing through gravel. I got out of my truck, and the cold hit me like a physical wall. The whole neighborhood was buried under about 8 inches of snow from a storm that had rolled through 2 days earlier. The HOA had not yet arranged for the private road to be plowed, by the way, which was a whole separate situation I'll get to. The entrance gate mechanism had an exterior panel with a manual release that was supposed to allow residents to open the gate by hand during power failures or mechanical issues. I found the panel, pulled the release lever, and the gate gave exactly 0 response. The release cable had snapped. The gate was locked, both electronically and mechanically. My name is Dan Fisher. I've lived in Maplewood Estates for 6 years. I bought my house here because I like the quiet neighborhood, the mature trees, the good school district, and yes, I'll admit it, I thought a gated community sounded nice. Safe. Orderly. 6 years later, I understand that the gate is less about safety and more about giving the HOA board a physical symbol of their authority, which they guard with the intensity of medieval castle lords. And the person most responsible for wielding that authority in the most irritating, petty, and occasionally illegal ways possible is a woman named Barbara Goodwin. Barbara Goodwin, HOA president for 4 consecutive years. Mid-50s, always wearing some kind of fleece vest no matter what the weather, always carrying a legal pad where she scribbles notes about violations she plans to pursue. She once cited a neighbor for having a bird feeder that was, quote, aesthetically inconsistent with community standards. She sent warning letters about Christmas lights being left up until January 8th, when the community guidelines said all exterior holiday decorations must be removed by January 6th. She had someone's basketball hoop measured because she suspected it was installed 6 inches closer to the curb than the approved distance. She was right, by the way. 6 inches. She pursued it with the passion of a war crimes prosecutor, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to that Tuesday night in January, 12 degrees, me standing outside my truck next to a broken gate that had just sealed off our entire neighborhood. I called Mrs. Patricia Holloway, who lived in the second house on the right and was the closest thing Maplewood Estates had to a community hub. She knew everyone and everything. She confirmed what I was already figuring out. Several residents who had been out that evening had been unable to get back in, and a few who had already been inside were now unable to get out. Her husband was on dialysis 3 times a week and needed to be at the medical center by 5 in the morning. My next-door neighbor, Kevin Park, had a newborn at home and had been stuck outside the gate for 20 minutes in his car waiting for someone to figure out a solution. I called the HOA emergency line. Every HOA, by law in our state, is required to maintain an emergency contact number for situations exactly like this. I'd actually never had to use it before. The phone rang 8 times and went to a voicemail that said, cheerfully, that the Maplewood Estates HOA board appreciated my call and that someone would return it within 2 to 3 business days. 2 to 3 business days, in 12-degree weather, with a gate trapping residents. I tried Barbara Goodwin's personal number, which was listed on the HOA website as the primary board contact. She picked up on the third ring, which surprised me because I genuinely expected more voicemail. Hello. Her voice was the careful, controlled kind that people use when they've already decided they're not going to be helpful. I explained the situation as clearly and calmly as I could. Broken gate mechanism. 40-plus residents potentially trapped. Temperature below 15 degrees. Manual release cable snapped. We needed the gate either repaired tonight or manually unlocked and left open until morning. There was a pause. Then Barbara said, Dan, the HOA does not have access to emergency repair services on a Tuesday night. The gate maintenance contract is with Secure Entry Systems, and they operate on standard business hours Monday through Friday. I told her that was fine. We could call them and ask for emergency service. Most commercial maintenance companies offer it for exactly these situations. That would incur an after-hours emergency service fee, Barbara said, still in that careful voice. I said yes, I understood that, and that was fine. The HOA had a reserve fund for exactly these kinds of situations. The reserve fund is not intended for after-hours convenience calls, Barbara said. Convenience. She called being trapped in your own neighborhood in 12-degree weather a convenience call. I kept my voice level, which took genuine effort. I told her that a resident needing to get to dialysis at 5 in the morning was not a convenience issue. I told her a newborn being in a car in these temperatures, while the father sat outside a broken gate, was not a convenience issue. I told her that if anything happened to any resident because of this broken gate, the HOA would be looking at serious liability. Barbara told me she would bring the matter before the board and that they would address it at the next scheduled meeting, which was in 11 days. 11 days. I stood there in the freezing dark for a second, just letting that sink in. She had just told me that she would schedule a discussion about the broken gate for 11 days from now. Not call a repair company. Not authorize emergency service. Schedule a discussion. I thanked her, hung up, and immediately got on the phone with Kevin Park to figure out a plan, because clearly Barbara Goodwin had decided that the gate crisis was not her problem tonight. Here's what we actually did. Kevin had gotten back inside eventually because I had found the manual gate panel, and with some effort and a flashlight and the combined strength of myself and a neighbor named Tom Greer who'd come out to help, we managed to force the gate partially open by manually defeating the locking bolt with a bolt cutter Kevin had in his garage. We got the gate open enough for cars to pass. It was not elegant, but it worked. The gate sat half open all night, in 12-degree weather. Anyone could walk in or drive in, because the thing that was supposed to keep the neighborhood secure was now wide open and completely non-functional. The irony of this was not lost on me. The next morning I woke up, poured a thermos of coffee, and sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop to start documenting everything. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a project manager for a mid-size construction company, which means I've spent the last 15 years learning to document everything, keep records, build paper trails, and understand contracts well enough to protect myself and my company from disputes. That skill set was about to get a significant workout. I pulled up our HOA's CC and RS, which stands for Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. It's basically the legal document that governs what the HOA can and cannot do. I'd read pieces of it over the years but never sat down and gone through the whole thing carefully. I fixed that over my morning coffee. Section 7.3 of our CC and RS was very clear. The HOA was responsible for the maintenance, repair, and operation of all common area infrastructure, including, but not limited to, the community entrance gate system and its associated mechanisms. Section 12.1 stated that in the event of a safety or emergency condition affecting common areas, the board was required to take reasonable and timely action to protect the health and safety of residents. Section 14.6 outlined the reserve fund and specified that it existed precisely for unplanned repair and replacement costs for common infrastructure. I also pulled up our state's HOA law, which I found on the state legislature's website. Our state had passed a fairly comprehensive set of HOA regulations a few years back following a series of high-profile HOA abuses. Among those regulations was a requirement that HOA boards respond to emergency safety conditions within 24 hours and take corrective action within a reasonable time frame. There was also a provision about the fiduciary duty of HOA board members, meaning they had a legal obligation to act in the interests of the community, not just their own preferences or convenience. I started a document. I put the date, time, and temperature at the top. I wrote down exactly what had happened the night before in chronological order. I wrote down the exact words Barbara had used on the phone, as best as I could remember them. I wrote down the names of residents who had been affected and the specific ways they'd been impacted. I noted that Patricia Holloway's husband had had to make alternate transportation arrangements for his dialysis appointment at 4:30 in the morning because they couldn't be certain the gate situation would be resolved. He'd called a cab in the middle of the night in 12-degree weather because his HOA wouldn't authorize an emergency repair. Then I sent an email to Barbara Goodwin and CC'd every other member of the HOA board, whose email addresses were all listed on the HOA website. I laid out the situation professionally and clearly. I cited the specific sections of the CC and RS and the state HOA law. I formally requested that the board authorize emergency repair of the gate mechanism within 24 hours per state law requirements. I requested a written response confirming the action that would be taken. I hit send and went to check on the gate. The gate was still half open. It was now 7:30 in the morning, and the temperature had dropped another 2 degrees overnight. There was a fresh light dusting of snow on the ground from something that had blown through in the early hours, and the whole entrance area looked like a scene from a snow globe that someone had shaken and then abandoned. The gate mechanism's motor box had a thin crust of ice on it. The broken cable was coated in frost. Tom Greer was already out there with a coffee cup, surveying the situation. Tom was a retired electrician with the kind of calm competence that comes from spending decades solving problems with your hands. He'd been the one who'd helped me get the gate forced open the night before. He looked at the motor box and shook his head. "Motor's probably seized up from the cold on top of whatever broke it," he said. "Even if they called a repair guy right now, it might take a few hours to sort out properly." I told him about my call with Barbara the night before and the email I'd sent this morning. Tom's expression didn't change much, but his coffee cup lowered slowly as I talked. When I finished, he said, "She really said convenience call, word for word." "Huh," Tom said. Then he went back to looking at the gate mechanism with the expression of a man mentally cataloging everything wrong with it. I went back inside and started making calls to my neighbors. Not a meeting, not yet, just individual conversations to let people know what was happening and to gather more documented accounts of the impact. I talked to Kevin Park, who had pictures on his phone of the gate from the previous night and the timestamp showing how long he'd been waiting. I talked to Patricia Holloway, who had a written record from her husband's medical transport, because the cab company had sent a receipt with the time and a note about the circumstances. I talked to a woman named Sandra Lim, who was 8 months pregnant and had been trying to get home from her prenatal appointment the previous evening and had sat in her car outside the gate for 35 minutes before Kevin, and I got it forced open. Sandra was understandably not happy. She said, very calmly and with the kind of measured fury that comes from being very pregnant and very cold and very inconvenienced, "I sat in my running car for 35 minutes in the dark because the gate wouldn't open, and when I called the HOA, the voicemail said 2 to 3 business days. I added her account to my document. By noon, I had heard back from Barbara Goodwin. The email was brief, and I have to say, impressively tone-deaf. She thanked me for my concerns. She said the board had discussed the matter informally and agreed that the gate repair would be scheduled through the normal maintenance request process. She said the HOA's maintenance coordinator would contact Secure Entry Systems during normal business hours to schedule a service visit. She did not give a timeline. She did not acknowledge the state law requirement for emergency response. She did not mention the reserve fund. She ended by reminding me that the HOA community guidelines encouraged residents to communicate with the board through official channels and to maintain a respectful and cooperative tone. That last line. Maintain a respectful and cooperative tone, as though I had been the one acting unreasonably. I read the email twice, took a breath, and then forwarded it to 14 of my neighbors with a note saying simply, I received this response from the HOA president regarding last night's gate emergency. I'm going to continue pushing for a real solution. Please let me know if you'd like to be included in the formal complaint I'm preparing. 12 of the 14 replied within an hour saying yes. The second night was rougher than the first. The temperature dropped to 6 degrees, which crossed the line from very cold into genuinely dangerous. The gate was still propped open with a piece of lumber Tom Greer had wedged into the frame to keep it from swinging shut and trapping people again. The neighborhood entrance looked like a construction zone. Snow had drifted into the gap around the gate and was piling up against the mechanism housing. Our private road inside the neighborhood still hadn't been plowed. By the way, because the HOA's contracted snow removal service required board authorization for anything beyond a 6-inch accumulation, and Barbara had apparently decided that authorization also required a board meeting. I was starting to see a pattern. Barbara Goodwin's approach to every single inconvenient problem was to schedule it, put it on the agenda, bring it before the board. What this accomplished in practice was that nothing requiring actual spending or action ever happened quickly, and the reserve fund, which our HOA collected from residents every month as part of our dues, sat collecting interest while residents sat in cold cars outside a broken gate. On the second day, I did some research into the HOA's financial records. In our state, HOA financial records are required to be available to residents upon request. I sent a formal written request to the board for the current balance of the reserve fund and the maintenance expenditure records for the past 12 months. Barbara responded that the financial records would be made available at the next annual meeting. I responded, citing the specific section of state law that required them to be provided within 10 business days of a written request, and noting that annual meetings were not an acceptable substitute for that legal requirement. She did not respond to the second email. Meanwhile, Tom Greer had been busy in his own way. Tom, it turned out, had been keeping a personal log of HOA maintenance issues for the last 3 years. He had it in a paper notebook, very neat, very detailed. Every time he had reported a maintenance issue to the HOA and every response he'd received. He also had a small security camera mounted on his porch that happened to point toward the street and captured the gate area at an angle. He went back through 3 months of footage and found something interesting. The gate mechanism had been making visible signs of failure for at least 6 weeks before it finally broke. You could see in the footage that the gate was moving slowly, hesitating, making partial opening and closing cycles. Tom had logged a maintenance report to the HOA about the gate motor behaving erratically 8 weeks prior. He found the email confirmation from the HOA acknowledging receipt of his report. There had been no follow-up, no repair, no inspection. Tom brought his notebook and his laptop with the footage clips to my kitchen table on the evening of day 2, and we sat together while the snow came down outside and the thermometer outside my window read 7 degrees, and we built out the full picture. The HOA had received a maintenance report about the gate mechanism 8 weeks ago. They had acknowledged it. They had done nothing. The gate had continued to deteriorate. It had then failed completely during one of the coldest nights of the year, trapping residents. When informed of the emergency, the board president had refused to authorize emergency repair, citing cost concerns and insisting on a normal business hours response. The gate had been propped open with lumber for 2 days in sub-zero temperatures. The private road remained unplowed. A dialysis patient had been forced to arrange alternate transport at 4:30 in the morning. A woman who was 8 months pregnant had sat in a cold car for 35 minutes unable to reach her home. We had emails. We had timestamps. We had Tom's security camera footage. We had the maintenance report from 8 weeks ago. We had Barbara's own written responses. We had medical transport receipts and Kevin's time-stamped photos. I also had a conversation with my brother-in-law, who was a real estate attorney. I called him after dinner on day 2 and walked him through the whole thing. He wasn't practicing HOA law specifically, but he knew the basics, and he confirmed everything I'd read in the CC and RS and the state law. He also pointed out something I hadn't considered, which was that the board's failure to act on a known maintenance issue, documented 8 weeks in advance, could potentially constitute negligence, and that if any resident had suffered a medical emergency as a result of being unable to access their home or call for emergency services due to the broken gate, the HOA and individual board members could face serious personal liability. He also said, send them one more formal letter. Make it very clear what they're exposed to. Sometimes people get sensible when they understand the actual stakes. I wrote that letter the next morning. Day 3. The gate was still propped open with Tom's lumber. The temperature that morning was 4 degrees. Kevin Park had sent me a voice message saying his newborn had developed a cold and he was not in a good mood about it, though to be fair he acknowledged that was probably not specifically the HOA's fault. Sandra Lim had spoken with her OB, who had noted in her file that she had reported sitting in a cold car for an extended period during her 3rd trimester. The letter I wrote was calm, professional, and very precise. I laid out the timeline. I cited the CC and RS, the state HOA regulations, the maintenance report Tom had filed 8 weeks earlier, and the board's documented failure to respond. I quoted Barbara's own email language. I outlined the potential liability the board was exposed to under state negligence standards. I stated clearly that the residents who had been affected were prepared to file a complaint with the state HOA regulatory office, pursue mediation, and if necessary, file a civil action against both the HOA as an entity and individual board members in their personal capacity. I also sent a copy, simultaneously, to the state's HOA regulatory office, which our state actually had. It wasn't a super powerful agency, but they investigated complaints, kept records, and could impose fines. The fact that I sent a copy there was mentioned clearly in the letter to the board. Then I sent the whole package, the letter, the documented timeline, Tom's footage clips, the maintenance report, Barbara's email responses, the medical transport receipt, the photos, all of it, to every resident in Maplewood Estates whose email address I had, which was 31 out of 43 households. The response from residents was not subtle. Within 2 hours of sending that email, I had responses from 22 households. 15 of them said they were fully prepared to support the complaint, and several had additional documentation of their own. Mrs. Chen in the house at the end of the court sent me a photo she'd taken from her window of the gate propped open with lumber with the caption, "This is what $500 a month in HOA dues buys us." 3 other families had been affected by the road not being plowed and had their own records of requests submitted and ignored. The community Facebook group for Maplewood Estates, which normally functioned as a place to post pictures of stray cats and ask if anyone had a good landscaper recommendation, became something else entirely. Residents started posting their own accounts. Someone posted a photo of the frozen gate mechanism with icicles hanging off the motor housing. Kevin Park posted the timestamps from his first night sitting outside the gate. Sandra Lim posted a measured but devastating account of sitting in her car for 35 minutes unable to get home while 8 months pregnant. Barbara Goodwin posted in the group too. Her post was 4 paragraphs long and talked about the HOA's commitment to responsible stewardship of community funds and the importance of following proper procedures. She said the gate situation was being handled through appropriate channels and asked residents to be patient and to trust the board's process. The responses to her post were not kind. I didn't pile on in the Facebook group. I stayed professional, posted a brief comment with factual information about the state regulatory complaint and the CC and R sections being invoked, and let everyone else handle the rest. On day 3, something shifted. I got a call mid-morning from a man named Gerald Stein, who I knew lived on the far side of the neighborhood and who I didn't know particularly well. Gerald turned out to be a retired judge. He had lived in Maplewood Estates for 11 years, was quiet, kept to himself, and had never had reason to get involved in HOA disputes before. He had read my email, reviewed the materials, and he was calling me to tell me that in his assessment the board's conduct was not just a policy disagreement, but a potential violation of fiduciary duty under state law. He then said something that stuck with me. The moment Barbara acknowledged the gate emergency and chose not to act, she made a decision, and the consequences of that decision may attach to her personally, not just to the HOA. He also said he would be happy to be named as a supporting party on the regulatory complaint. Having a retired judge offering to sign onto your complaint changes the temperature of a situation, and I mean that in both the literal and figurative sense. I updated the formal complaint with Gerald's supporting statement and resubmitted it to the state HOA regulatory office. I also sent a revised letter to the board noting the updated complaint and listing all the residents who were formally supporting it, including Gerald Stein with his title noted. Barbara Goodwin called me at 3 in the afternoon on day 3. This time her voice was different. The careful, controlled tone was still there, but underneath it was something else. A tightness. A slight edge of something she was trying to manage. She said the board had met informally and agreed to authorize the emergency repair of the gate. She said secure entry systems had been contacted and would be sending a technician that afternoon. I said that was good. I asked her to confirm in writing. She said she would send a follow-up email. I said that was great. I also said I wanted to discuss the plowing situation and the financial records request while I had her on the phone. There was a pause. Then she said the plowing would be authorized today, and the financial records would be made available within the state-required 10-day window. I said thank you and reminded her that the regulatory complaint was still pending, and that whether it was withdrawn or not would depend on the board's actions going forward. She said she understood. The secure entry systems technician arrived at 4:30. His name was Marcus, and he was a stocky guy with a heavy winter coat and the efficiently cheerful demeanor of someone who had done this job in every kind of weather condition imaginable. He took one look at the gate mechanism and then looked at me and Tom, who were both standing there watching. "How long has it been like this?" he asked. I said 2.5 days. He looked at the motor housing, at the snapped cable, at the ice buildup inside the mechanism panel. "And before that, was it running rough?" I pointed to Tom. Tom said, "About 8 weeks. I filed a report." Marcus nodded slowly with the expression of someone who was not surprised. He said the motor had likely been deteriorating for a while and the extreme cold had been the final factor. A routine inspection 8 weeks ago when the report came in would have caught it. The repair would have been a couple $100. What he was looking at now, with the seized motor and the snapped cable and the freeze damage to the internal components, was going to be closer to $1,200. He had the gate working in about 2.5 hours. The gate swung open and closed, smooth and quiet, and a small cluster of neighbors who had come out to watch gave a little spontaneous cheer that I thought was charming and completely warranted. Tom looked at Marcus and said, "What would you put in writing about the condition of this unit?" Marcus said he'd include his full assessment in the service report, including the estimated time the deterioration had been occurring and the relationship between the delayed repair and the increased repair cost. Tom said that would be very helpful and gave him his email address. The plow truck came the next morning. It was a private contractor the HOA used, and he did a good job clearing the road in about 40 minutes. The difference in the neighborhood was immediate. Cars moved normally. People could get in and out without navigating drifts and ruts. Patricia Holloway's husband got to his dialysis appointment without incident. Small mercies. Over the following days, the regulatory complaint proceeded. The state HOA office sent a formal inquiry to the board requesting documentation of their response to the gate emergency and their protocols for emergency maintenance situations. The board was required to respond within 15 days. I also received the financial records I'd requested. Tom and I went through them together. What we found was, let's say, educational. The reserve fund had a balance of just under $68,000. In the previous 12 months, expenditures from the reserve fund had totaled about $4,000, all on routine landscaping and minor repairs. The gate motor deterioration had been noted in the maintenance log, meaning the HOA had its own internal records showing they knew about the issue, but no expenditure had been approved to address it. There was also a line item that caught my eye. $3,000 paid to a company called Goodwin Property Consulting for, quote, community planning and governance advisory services. I stared at that for a moment. Goodwin, Barbara Goodwin. I looked it up. Goodwin Property Consulting was a sole proprietorship registered in our state. The registered owner was Barbara Ann Goodwin, HOA board president of Maplewood Estates. The HOA was paying Barbara's own consulting company out of resident funds, without, as far as I could tell from the financial records, any competitive bidding process or formal disclosure to residents. I called my brother-in-law back. He was quiet for a moment after I explained what I'd found. Then he said, "That's a conflict of interest issue, Dan. Depending on your state's HOA statutes, that could be a violation requiring disclosure and board vote without the interested party voting. And if she voted on it herself, that's potentially a more serious problem." I checked the meeting minutes that had been posted on the HOA website. The payment to Goodwin Property Consulting had been approved in a board vote in September. The minutes showed 5 board members present and voting. Barbara Goodwin was listed as voting in favor. She had voted to pay her own company, without disclosing the conflict, without abstaining. I updated the regulatory complaint. My brother-in-law connected me with a colleague of his who actually specialized in HOA law. The specialist's name was Rebecca Torres, and she agreed to do an initial consultation for free after I sent her the full package of documentation. She confirmed everything within about 24 hours. The self-dealing issue, meaning Barbara voting to pay her own company from HOA funds without disclosure, was a clear violation of both our CC and RS and state HOA law. Our CC and RS had an explicit conflict of interest provision in Section 18.4, requiring any board member with a financial interest in a matter to disclose that interest and recuse from the vote. State law reinforced this. The violation was documented in the meeting minutes, which were public record. Rebecca also confirmed that the gate situation, combined with the documented failure to act on the prior maintenance report and the refusal to authorize emergency repair during dangerous conditions, constituted a pattern of breach of fiduciary duty that was worth pursuing formally. She agreed to represent the coalition of residents, which now included 26 households, on a contingency arrangement, meaning she would get paid from any settlement or judgment and residents paid nothing up front. When Barbara Goodwin received the letter from Rebecca Torres on behalf of 26 residents of Maplewood Estates, I heard about it from 3 different neighbors within an hour. Barbara had called an emergency board meeting for the following Tuesday. Her first emergency meeting, notably, despite the fact that she had declined to treat an actual gate emergency as sufficient cause for one. The meeting was open to all residents, which was required by state law, and I think Barbara had expected maybe a dozen people to show up. She got 31. Every chair in the HOA meeting room was filled, and people were standing along the walls. Tom Greer was there with his notebook. Sandra Lim was there with her husband. Gerald Stein was there, and when he walked in, Barbara's expression shifted in a way that I found quietly satisfying. Mrs. Chen was there with her phone, which I noticed had its camera app open. I sat in the front row. The meeting started with Barbara attempting to run it as though it were a normal monthly meeting. She went through the agenda in a crisp, businesslike manner, clearly hoping to get to the gate issue and the other matters as line items rather than as the entire reason everyone was there. She got about 90 seconds in before a man named Phil Russo, who lived 3 doors down from me, and who had the energy of someone who had been waiting a very long time to say something, put up his hand and said, "Barbara, can we talk about why we're all actually here?" Barbara said they would get to agenda item 3, the gate mechanism, shortly. Phil said, "I'd like to get to agenda item 1, which is why the HOA president was paying her own company out of the reserve fund." The room went very quiet. Barbara's expression cycled through surprise, controlled composure, and something that flickered briefly and honestly looked like fear before she locked it back down. She said that Goodwin Property Consulting had provided legitimate services to the HOA and that the board had properly voted to approve the expenditure. Gerald Stein, from the second row, said quietly and very clearly, "Did you disclose your financial interest before that vote?" Another silence. Barbara said that the nature of the relationship was understood by the board. Gerald said, "That's not the same thing as disclosure, and I think you know that." I handed out printed copies of the relevant CC and R section, the meeting minutes showing Barbara's vote, and a summary of state law requirements. I'd printed 35 copies. They were gone in about 45 seconds. The meeting dissolved into controlled chaos that Rebecca Torres, who had joined us by speakerphone in the corner, helped me navigate by periodically interjecting to note which actions were legally permissible and which were not. The board members who were not Barbara were visibly uncomfortable. 2 of them, including the treasurer, a quiet man named Robert Chen, who was no relation to Mrs. Chen in the audience, looked like they genuinely hadn't known about the consulting arrangement and were processing this information in real time with increasing alarm. By the end of the meeting, the following had been agreed to, partly through board vote and partly because Rebecca made it clear what the alternative looked like. The payment to Goodwin Property Consulting would be reviewed by an independent auditor selected by the residents. Barbara would be placed on administrative leave from her board responsibilities pending that review. An interim president would serve while the review was completed. The HOA would implement a formal emergency response protocol for common area infrastructure failures. The reserve fund expenditure policies would be revised with resident input. Barbara did not resign at the meeting. She sat through the whole thing with her spine straight and her legal pad in front of her, and her face arranged into an expression of dignified composure that I think she was genuinely working very hard to maintain. But when people around her were voting to suspend her authority, and when the words independent auditor and conflict of interest were being used repeatedly in relation to her name, the composure had to be doing some heavy lifting. The auditor, a firm called Halstead Financial that several residents agreed on through a quick email vote over the following 2 days, got to work within a week. They had access to all HOA financial records for the previous 24 months. What they found about Goodwin Property Consulting was worse than I'd initially thought. The $3,000 I'd spotted was not the only payment. There had been 5 separate payments over the previous 20 months totaling $11,400. The services described were vague. Things like community standards review and governance consultation and policy framework assessment. There were no contracts, no formal scopes of work, no competitive bids, and no documented deliverables. In the auditor's professional language, there was no evidence that the payments corresponded to any specific services rendered. $11,400, pulled from HOA resident funds, paid to Barbara Goodwin's own company, by votes she had participated in without disclosure. The auditor's report went to the board and to Rebecca Torres and to the state HOA regulatory office simultaneously. The regulatory office escalated the matter from a complaint investigation to a formal enforcement proceeding. They contacted the state attorney general's HOA unit, which was a relatively new office but an active one. Here's where things went from HOA drama to something more serious. The Attorney General's office looked at the documentation and determined that the payments to Goodwin Property Consulting, given the lack of disclosure, the self-interested voting, and the apparent absence of legitimate services rendered, met the threshold for investigation as potential fraudulent conversion of funds. That's a real legal term. Fraudulent conversion. It means taking other people's money for your own use. 2 investigators from the Attorney General's office came to Maplewood Estates on a Wednesday afternoon in early February. The snow had eased up a bit by then, but it was still full winter, gray sky, bare trees, the neighborhood quiet and cold. They knocked on Barbara Goodwin's door. She answered. They identified themselves and explained they were investigating a complaint regarding HOA financial management. I found out about this from Tom, who had been driving past when the investigators arrived and had slowed down just enough to observe the situation with the careful casualness of a retired electrician with an excellent memory for detail. Barbara was not arrested that day. Let's be clear about that. The investigation was ongoing. But she was formally interviewed. She retained her own attorney, and the Attorney General's office issued a press statement about 3 weeks later noting that they had opened an investigation into alleged financial misconduct by an HOA board member in our county. The local news picked it up. It was a small story, a few paragraphs in the regional section, but it named Maplewood Estates and referenced an HOA board member under investigation for potential misuse of community funds. It didn't name Barbara specifically in the initial reporting because the investigation was ongoing, but within the community, there wasn't exactly a mystery about who they were talking about. Barbara resigned from the board while the investigation was pending. Her attorney sent a letter to the board stating that she was resigning for personal reasons and wished the community well. It was about as dignified an exit as the situation allowed. The interim president was a guy named Marcus Webb, no relation to the repair technician, who had been on the board for 2 years as secretary and who turned out to be extremely competent, very organized, and refreshingly uninterested in drama. He called me the day after taking over and said, "Dan, I want to close out all the outstanding issues. Where are we?" I gave him the full list. The gate was repaired. The road plowing authorization was in place. The emergency response protocol needed to be formally adopted. The financial records request needed to be properly closed. The regulatory complaint was still open pending the Attorney General's investigation. The civil aspect of the residents' claims was being discussed. Marcus said, "What would it take to resolve the civil claims?" I talked to Rebecca Torres. We talked to the coalition of residents. The civil claims were primarily about the failure to maintain the gate, the refusal to authorize emergency repair, and the consequential damages to residents, including medical transport costs, documented inconvenience, and in the case of Sandra Lim, documented medical record notation about the cold exposure during pregnancy. Nobody wanted to litigate this for years. What the residents wanted was accountability, better governance going forward, and fair compensation for the documented out-of-pocket costs. The HOA, now under Marcus Webb, agreed to a settlement for the affected residents. The specific amounts were modest but meaningful. Patricia Holloway's husband's medical transport costs were reimbursed with interest. Sandra Lim received a payment that her husband said would cover a lot of the baby supplies they'd been saving up for. Kevin Park got his documented expenses covered. Other residents received smaller amounts for documented costs and inconvenience. The total settlement came out of the reserve fund, which still had plenty in it since it hadn't been spent on anything useful for quite a while. The irony of Barbara's financial hoarding being what funded the settlement against her HOA was not lost on anyone. The regulatory proceeding wrapped up several weeks after the Attorney General's investigation got fully underway. The state HOA Regulatory Office issued a formal finding that Maplewood Estates HOA had violated state emergency response requirements and had failed to maintain required financial transparency. The HOA was fined. The fine was modest, but it went on the official record, and the board was required to complete a governance training program within 90 days. The Attorney General's investigation took several more months. I'm not going to pretend I had inside knowledge of every step of it. What I know is what eventually became public record. Barbara Goodwin entered into a settlement agreement with the state. She admitted to no criminal wrongdoing in the agreement, but she did agree to repay the full $11,400 to the HOA plus the cost of the audit, which was another $4,000. She also agreed to permanent bar from serving as an officer or director of any HOA or condominium association in the state, permanently barred. She could never be an HOA president again, in our state, ever. The local news did a follow-up piece when the settlement was announced. This one was bigger than the initial story. The headline was something about HOA board member repaying funds following investigation into self-dealing, and it included a quote from the Attorney General's office about protecting homeowners from financial misconduct by those in positions of community authority. There was a photo of the Attorney General that went with it. Barbara was not quoted in the article. Her attorney declined to comment. The settlement check, $11,400 plus audit costs, was deposited into the HOA Reserve Fund in March. Marcus Webb sent the community an email announcing it, along with a full accounting of where the HOA finances stood, the new emergency response protocol, the revised conflict of interest policy with mandatory disclosure requirements, and a schedule for upcoming maintenance needs that had been deferred. Spring came. The snow melted. The gate worked perfectly every single day through the winter thaw and into April. The private road was plowed promptly every time it snowed after the new authorization protocol was in place. The community felt different. I don't know exactly how to describe it other than to say it felt like a place where people were actually looking out for each other, instead of just following rules handed down from one person who had decided she was in charge of everything. We had our first real community meeting under the new governance structure in April, and it was an actual productive meeting where real things got discussed and decided. The budget for the year was reviewed transparently. The maintenance schedule, including a new semi-annual inspection of the gate mechanism, was adopted. A community feedback process was implemented so residents could raise concerns without having to research state law and write legal letters. Tom Greer was elected to the board at that meeting. He accepted with his characteristic economy of words, said he planned to make sure the maintenance logs were kept properly and followed up on, and sat down. People applauded. He looked mildly uncomfortable with the applause but pleased underneath it. Kevin Park, whose kid had survived the winter cold episode just fine, and was now a healthy several months old with the loudest lungs I'd ever heard on a baby that size, asked at the meeting whether we could also look at the community's internet service contract, because he thought we were overpaying. This launched a 45-minute conversation that had nothing to do with my story, but which resulted in the board agreeing to solicit competitive bids, so I count it as a win for the general spirit of the thing. Sandra Lim brought her newborn to the April meeting, a girl, born healthy in late February. She sat in the back row with the baby asleep in a carrier and spent most of the meeting looking at her phone, occasionally glancing up when something interesting was being discussed. At one point, she caught my eye across the room and gave me a small, tired, genuine smile. I nodded back. Gerald Stein stayed on as a kind of informal elder statesman of community governance. He didn't want a board seat, but he made it clear he was available if questions of proper procedure came up. And having a retired judge willing to offer that was something Marcus Webb was smart enough to take full advantage of. I sat at my kitchen table on a Saturday in late April with the windows open for the first time since October, actual fresh air coming in, birds doing their thing outside, and I reread the email chain from January. Barbara's convenience call email, my own carefully worded responses, the letter from Rebecca Torres, the regulatory complaint. It was like reading a record of a fever breaking. I thought about what had actually been at stake those first couple of nights. 12 degrees. 6 degrees. A dialysis patient at 4:30 in the morning. A pregnant woman in a cold car. None of those things were abstractions. They were real people in real danger because one person in a position of authority had decided that protecting the reserve fund from an emergency repair expense was more important than the well-being of 43 families. And that same person had been quietly paying herself out of that same reserve fund for almost 2 years. I'm not particularly proud of getting into a fight with my HOA. I didn't enjoy the meetings or the emails or the late nights going through financial records. I'm a project manager. I spend enough of my life in documentation and disputes during business hours without adding HOA legal battles to my personal time. But I am genuinely proud of what the community did once people had the information and a clear path forward. 31 households showing up to a meeting, 26 signing onto a legal complaint, people sharing documentation and supporting each other's accounts. Gerald Stein quietly dropping his title into the conversation at exactly the right moment. Tom with his 3 years of meticulous handwritten maintenance logs. Kevin with his timestamps. Sandra with her calm, precise account of what had happened to her. That's what Barbara Goodwin never really understood about the community she was supposedly managing. She thought the gate was about control. She thought the reserve fund was about authority. She thought the meeting agenda was about power. She missed the part where 43 families were also 43 sets of people who had lives and problems and skills and knowledge and who, when it actually mattered, were perfectly capable of taking care of each other and holding accountable the people who weren't. The gate works fine now. Every morning when I leave for work, I pull up to it, press the fob, and it swings open promptly and cleanly, the motor running quiet and smooth. Marcus Webb made sure secure entry systems did a full overhaul and not just the emergency repair. They replaced the motor, the cable, the control panel, and the manual release mechanism all at once, while the reserve fund had money in it, and before the cold weather came back around next winter. It cost about $4,000 all told. The reserve fund, remember, had $68,000 in it. $4,000. Barbara Goodwin refused to authorize a $1,200 emergency repair in 12-degree weather, and it cost her $11,000 in restitution, $4,000 in audit costs, her board position, her ability to ever hold an HOA position in this state again, and a mention in the regional news that I'm pretty confident came up in search results every time someone Googled her name, for the cost of one emergency gate repair call. Some people are very good at calculating what things cost. They're less good at calculating what being wrong costs. Tom and I had a beer on my back porch in early May, watching the last of the winter damage in my yard sort itself out, the grass coming back, the mud drying up, everything slowly returning to normal. It was still cool enough that the beer was pleasantly cold rather than refreshing. Tom said, "You know what's funny?" I said, "What?" "I filed that maintenance report in November, 8 weeks before the gate broke. If they just sent a guy out then, none of this would have happened." I said, "I know." Tom said, $11,000 and a gate that works. I said, "Yep." We sat with that for a minute. Tom said, "I'm going to institute quarterly gate inspections when I'm on the board." I said that sounded like an excellent plan. He nodded, drank his beer, and looked at the yard. The thing I'll remember most about that whole winter, past the cold and the frustration and the hours of documentation, is that community meeting in February. The one where 31 families showed up and filled every chair and stood against the walls. The one where Barbara Goodwin sat at the front of the room with her legal pad and her careful composure, and discovered that the community she'd been running as a private fiefdom had, quietly and thoroughly, organized itself. She'd had 4 years as HOA president, and in those 4 years she'd sent violation notices and enforced guidelines, and protected the reserve fund, and generally operated as though the neighborhood existed to support the HOA rather than the other way around. And then one Tuesday night in January, in 12 degrees, a gate broke, and everything she'd built started to crack with it. I drove out through the gate the next morning at 7:15, coffee in the cup holder, radio on low, the neighborhood quiet and clean behind me. The gate swung open as I approached. It swung closed in my rearview mirror, smooth and precise. The motor made no sound worth noticing. It was a nice neighborhood. Always had been, under everything. I pulled out onto the main road and headed to work, and I did not think about Barbara Goodwin or HOA regulations or reserve funds for the entire rest of the day, which felt like its own small victory. A few weeks after everything settled down, I got an email from a man in another gated community about 30 miles away. He'd seen the regional news piece. His HOA was having its own issues, different details, but the same basic pattern of a board president making unilateral decisions and stonewalling residents. He wanted advice. I sent him back a fairly long email. I told him to read his CC and RS carefully, specifically the emergency response provisions and the conflict of interest requirements. I told him to file everything in writing and keep every response. I told him to check his state's HOA law because more states than people realize have real regulatory teeth if you know where to look. I told him to talk to his neighbors, not just the ones who were already angry but the quiet ones, the ones who hadn't gotten involved yet, because those were often the people with the most useful skills and knowledge once they understood what was actually happening. I told him that sometimes the person who's been in charge for a long time has been counting on the fact that nobody was paying close enough attention to the details, and that when people start paying attention, things tend to change. He thanked me. I don't know how his situation turned out. I hope well. Maplewood Estates had its first truly uneventful winter in a long time the following year. The gate was inspected in October, given a clean bill of health by Marcus and Tom, and secure entry systems. The road plowing authorization was pre-approved for the season with clear trigger conditions, so nobody had to wait for a board vote every time it snowed. The reserve fund balance was published quarterly in a newsletter that Marcus started, 2 pages, nothing fancy, just clear information about what the HOA was doing and what it was spending and what was coming up. Nobody got trapped. Nobody had to sit in a cold car outside a broken gate. Nobody had to arrange medical transport at 4 in the morning. The neighborhood just worked, quietly and normally, the way it was supposed to. That's not a small thing. I know it doesn't sound dramatic. But after everything that had happened, after those nights in 12-degree weather, and the emails and the meetings and the regulatory complaints and the Attorney General's office, the fact that it just worked was everything. The gate opened when it was supposed to. It closed when it was supposed to. The mechanism ran clean and smooth through the coldest nights of that next winter, through 2 big snowstorms and a stretch of temperatures that reminded me unpleasantly of that January a year before. Not once did it trap anyone. That's the whole story. The HOA refused to fix the gate. The gate trapped residents in temperatures that could kill them. The residents documented everything, found the legal framework, built the case, and held the right people accountable. The self-dealing got exposed. The regulatory consequences came down. The guilty party paid the price, literally and professionally. The community came out the other side with better governance, a working gate, and a genuine sense that they had each other's backs. And Barbara Goodwin was permanently barred from ever being an HOA president again. Which means she has a lot of free time now. No more legal pads to fill. No more violation notices to draft. No more reserve fund to protect from emergency repairs that might cost a fraction of a percent of its balance. I genuinely hope she's doing okay, I mean that. I have no personal animosity toward her now that it's done. But I'll be honest, I hope she drives past a gated community sometimes and thinks about that Tuesday night in January, 12 degrees, the gate, the phone call where she said convenience. I hope it's educational.